Thank you, Benedicte, and good morning, everyone. I'm Arve Hansen, and I'm from SUM and NFU and a bit of the Oslo Academy as well. And I've been given the great privilege and honor to introduce our first keynote speaker. He's a truly outstanding scholar with a truly impressive career. Originally from Penang in Malaysia, which I would like to add is home to probably the best food in the world. But originally from Penang, he has an international background from places like Yale, Harvard, Cambridge, and the National University of Singapore. He has written and edited more than 100 books, and I'm sure many of you have benefited from many of them. I know for sure those of us with an interest in Southeast Asia and the political economy of Southeast Asia have. And the books have been influential. Books on, for example, development economics, industrial policy, rent-seeking, books on Southeast Asia's misunderstood miracle, as well as the many books on development in Malaysia. A highly respected academic, even by those who do not share his sometimes radical views. But furthermore, which makes him even more relevant for this conference, he moved over time from academia towards trying to make a difference through global governance organizations, with positions such as the UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in UNDESA, and the Assistant Director General and Coordinator for Economic and Social Development at the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO. Jomo yesterday told me that the original title of this keynote was Revisiting Multilateralism for Better Global Governance. And I was told that was because multilateralism has been sort of the hope that we could cling to. And apparently now there's no such hope left. So instead, to deliver the keynote, Improving Global Governance, Trade, Finance, and Nutrition, please welcome Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram.
Thank you very much for those very kind words of introduction. Thank you for all those who have made my visit here and this participation in the next day and a half possible. I'm particularly honored and appreciate this invitation. The last major book I did on governance was entitled very skeptically, Is Good Governance Good for Development? And the implicit answer is no. However, I have a rather different view about global governance, and that's why I was very happy to accept this invitation. But it is important for me to acknowledge the hospitality of all those involved. Let me begin by noting something which Bertolt Brecht said. He was asked, what do you sing in these dark times, referring to the rise of the Nazis in Germany. He said, you sing about the dark times. And I think this is basically the challenge before us today. What do you do in these very difficult times? What do you do in terms of trying to understand and retain hope and retain the effort for trying to improve conditions. So it is with that I approach the subject. It has become very traditional in some of the literature, especially in the economics literature, which unfortunately is paradigmatic and dominates the social sciences in very profound but also insidious ways, to think about many problems in terms of economic thinking. So you have rational choice, imitating rational expectations in economics and so on and so forth. It has often been, the challenge of global governance is often seen in terms of global public goods. And this, I would suggest, is actually a very limiting way of looking at global governance, partly because it presumes that markets are the solution, regardless of what the nature of the problem is. It requires a global public authority, which does not currently exist. And obviously, for the foreseeable future, the idea of global democracy is really quite inconceivable in practice. So what do we do instead? What kinds of international cooperation are possible? And as hinted by our last two speakers, we are living in times when, to quote the president-elect, Mr. Trump, he does not want to see, he does not expect any serious multilateralism. His choice of UN ambassador to the United Nations is a choice which is dictated not only by gender considerations, but also by the fact that she happens to have parents who are born in India, and therefore that qualifies for her to discuss international matters. And I think this is ominous, because we are going to deal with a world increasingly where the major multilateral institutions have been systematically weakened over recent decades, and especially in recent years. So the problem does not begin with President-elect Trump. It begins much, much earlier. And I say this with a heavy sense of responsibility, because this is the land where your parliament decides on who the Nobel laureates for peace are. And some of the choices, I think many of you will agree, in the last decade are really mind-boggling, to say the least. So what does that imply? What does that mean when multilateralism is so profoundly under threat, and has been under threat for many years in the recent past? And to do this, I have selected to speak on three themes, not only because, in a sense, trade and finance may seem to be related, but precisely because they are so different. And it basically suggests that there is no single format. There's no single way of looking at the challenges of global governance which can pretend to be universalized. There is a need to think about the challenges of global governance in a variegated fashion, and this, I think, is the challenge before us. Now, let me begin Let me begin with some comments about trade. I think it's generally agreed, and there's been very little challenge to this. So some very important work done in the United Nations at about the middle of the 20th century by the late Hans Singer, as well as subsequently by Raoul Prebisch, who had a major influence through the United Nations system. They showed that the terms of trade for primary commodities, as opposed to manufacturers, has basically declined. The IMF and many others have shown that this trend has continued in the second half of the 20th century, and arguably into the beginning of the 21st century. Another man, Arthur Lewis, the late Arthur Lewis, showed that the terms of trade for tropical agricultural goods had declined in relation to temperate agricultural goods. And his work has also been confirmed by, among others, Bilge Erten, a young woman economist who used to be at Columbia. I'm not sure whether she's still at Columbia, and came to join us at the United Nations for a brief period. And then more recently, you will find that the terms of trade for manufactured goods from developing countries have basically declined in relation to those from developed countries. This may be due to various factors. Some people would argue that the strengthening of intellectual property rights have been very important in this regard, but there are other possible explanations. And one of the great advocates of trade liberalization, a man by the name of Jagdish Bhagwati, who's a professor at Columbia University, wrote about more than half a century ago about the phenomenon of immiserizing growth. In other words, you can continue to enhance productivity, you can enhance growth, but nonetheless have a situation where your net incomes might actually decline. And this phenomenon of immiserizing growth, although not necessarily always confirmed, is a very important possibility. And it suggests certain insights in his own work which may not have been reflected in some of his subsequent work on trade, but nonetheless remains important for us today. So this graph basically shows you what has happened to primary commodity prices in the 20th century, and this basically gives you a sense of what happened with manufactured goods from the developing countries in terms of trade in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. Now, one of the, those of you who have heard of Professor Bhagwati will know that he's not exactly known for his modesty. And he, nonetheless, has actually removed one of his articles from his own website. And it's an article he wrote in the year 2005 about the rationale for what was then being discussed in the World Trade Organization, something called aid for trade. And he basically made 3 very, very important arguments, which I think are very telling and continue to be relevant for us today. First, he pointed out to us that most developing countries, especially the poorest developing countries, receive much of their tax revenue from trade taxes, particularly from import tariffs. Now, this should come as no surprise because over 2 centuries ago, the father of the U.S. economic planning, of U.S. economic the conceptualization of the U.S. as a national economy, Alexander Hamilton, actually his crowning achievement during his brief tenure as Treasury Secretary was to create a customs house to collect taxes. And this was, of course, extremely important for revenue from the United States. So the loss of tariff revenue for many of the poorest countries is a very major loss and represents about half of total tax revenue being gone. So it's not surprising that many of the poorest countries today collect less than 10%. In other words, it's a single digit of their total national income is collected in the form of taxation. Add to that the fact that they have so little national income to begin with. So when you collect such a small proportion of very low national income, you basically don't collect very much. So the capacity of those governments to do anything is fundamentally compromised at the outset by the fact that they do not have any significant revenue to begin with. As 2 other observations by Bhagwati are telling. First, he said, countries who participate in trade liberalization need to be compensated for the loss of production and export capacities. And they're not being compensated currently, and therefore you needed aid for trade, according to him. And the third argument which he made, which is equally compelling, is that new production and export capacities and capabilities do not emerge from nowhere. They need to be built. In other words, he had implicitly a dynamic view of comparative advantage. That is not something which you analyze in very static terms as most economists tend to do these days, but rather you begin to recognize that comparative advantage is something you build over time. And this was his third insight, which I think is still relevant. Now let's look at what has happened. Basically, since the financial crisis of 2008, growth has slowed down tremendously. We have seen since 2014, primary commodity prices have basically collapsed. And we have also seen trade surpluses and reserves of most developing countries basically declining tremendously. Now let's look at international trade governance very, very quickly. At the time of Bretton Woods in 1944, there was discussion about how to reorganize the world economy after what had happened during the 1930s. And the view was that there would be three major instruments, 3 major institutions. One would be the International Monetary Fund. The second would be the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development to rebuild the world economy and national economies after the devastation of the Second World War. and also the second part, development, recognizing the challenges of development for post-colonial economies which are going to emerge after the Second World War. And the third element, which was emphasized in Bretton Woods, was to create conditions for the growth of trade, which would be supportive of these two aspirations, reconstruction and development. Unfortunately, the US Congress, in its wisdom, decided to reject the creation of the International Trade Organization, the ITO, in 1948. And as a compromise, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was created as a compromise at the end of the 1940s. The preceding round of trade negotiations, often referred to as the Uruguay round because they began at Punta del Este in Uruguay, basically led to the establishment of the World Trade Organization. But the World Trade Organization, for those who are interested, was a far cry from the ITO in its original conceptualization. And this World Trade Organization has come into being since the middle of the 1990s, and it fundamentally redefined the rules. And it's very important, I think, for us to look at how the ITO was conceptualized, the GATT was conceptualized, and the World Trade Organization has been conceptualized. So instead of signing on to a list of obligations as you developed and could take on those obligations, you now have a single undertaking. Everybody, the myth of the level playing field. All of us are equal on this playing field of international trade. And then in addition, besides the previous focus of GATT on trade in manufactures, you had a range of other trade-related issues. Intellectual property rights, investment, et cetera, were all added on. So you had a huge range of issues which were not traditionally conceived of as trade issues, which were added on. Part of the reason, of course, was because there was many of the other existing institutions for international governance were inadequate or were seen to be wanting from the perspective not of the nations, but from the perspective of the most powerful institutions which had emerged, namely the transnational corporations. So the transnational corporations were unhappy, for example, with WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. It had no enforcement capacity. So you brought through TRIPS this intellectual property, trade-related intellectual property into the WTO and enforced through the WTO intellectual property rights on the world. And so this has basically become very, very crucial in terms of what has been happening. Now, it's also very important for us to recognize that much of what goes on under trade liberalization is not necessarily trade augmenting or promoting, and certainly not growth augmenting or promoting. Rather, it often involves diversion. Now, this becomes especially clear, for example, when you think about the bilateral agreements as well as the so-called plurilateral agreements, which include regional agreements. But you can also mathematically and otherwise demonstrate that trade liberalization is often trade diverting rather than trade promoting. So this myth that plurilateralism and bilateralism are basically trade promoting has really to be challenged and examined very fundamentally and looked at in relation to multilateralism. Now, many of you who are older may still remember what happened after the creation of the WTO. There was a push to put in a great number of issues at the first ministerial meeting in Singapore, and those were called the so-called Singapore issues. Developing countries realized they had been bamboozled with the creation of the WTO. They were, quite honestly, very ill-prepared. They did not realize what they were signing up for, and so they were stuck with an organization with rules which were basically fundamentally against their interests, and they tried to roll it back in Singapore. So they refused to take on put on many of these issues. Developed countries, by and large, the US on the one hand, and the EU on the other hand, basically worked together to continue the effort. And the effort resulted in African nations leading a walkout at the Seattle ministerial meetings. At the Seattle ministerial meetings, there was tremendous mobilization of civil society, a phenomenon which is not known today because things changed very fundamentally after 9/11. But there was this tremendous mobilization in Seattle, and the result was the Seattle talks seemed to portend the end of effective trade multilateralism through the WTO. But 9/11, I mean, what I'm going to say can sound very cynical, but 9/11 was actually an opportunity to give all this a second chance. And so developing countries were very sympathetic and agreed in the aftermath of 9/11 to allow opportunity to create a new negotiations agenda. The compromise from the developed countries was to ensure that the new trade agenda would be supportive of development. And hence, the so-called Doha round has always been referred to as the Doha development round. This was the commitment made to get people back to the negotiating table after the fiasco at Seattle. Unfortunately, there has been very little progress. There's been very little progress not only on development issues traditionally conceived, it has also been very little progress on food security issues. And some of you may be familiar with some of the issues involved with India's commitment with its 2013 Food Security Act to try to ensure that there would be no more starvation in India through various interventions which are deemed to be in violation of the Agreement on Agriculture of the WTO. So this is basically where we are at right now, and I think it's very important for us to recognize that the situation is not promising. At Nairobi last December, at the last ministerial meeting, basically Michael Froman, the US trade representative, who will no longer be in office in about 2 months' time, Mike Froman came to the meeting and said, I now have the blueprint for trade agreements for the 21st century in the form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is the way to go, and I want to reintroduce issues. The European Commissioner for Trade agreed to many of these. She's somebody you might be familiar with. She agreed to this, and basically it meant that there was next to nothing which came out of Nairobi. Given the mood in Washington today, given the attitudes in Washington today, it is very likely that the Doha round, as conceived of in 2001, is for all intents and purposes dead. This is the situation we are in, and my concern partly is that multilateralism more generally is fundamentally threatened for a variety of reasons. Let me move very quickly to a second set of issues, and this is the area of finance. Many of us think of globalization principally in terms of trade, of greater trade of goods and services across borders and so on and so forth. But in fact, if you look at this graph, what you basically see is that cross-border financial transactions have grown far, far greater. Now, of course, you can see that this graph stops conveniently in 2008. And of course, the world has been very different since the financial crisis of 2008. But nonetheless, there has been for a variety of slightly different reasons than before 2009, a resurgence of cross-border flows of finance. And it's very important to recognize that there was a myth in economics that there would be, if you opened up barriers between countries, there would be a natural flow of funds from the capital-rich to the capital-poor countries. Now, this didn't happen. A cynical Malaysian economist who, writing in 1960, said, it is like opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly in than to fly out. Okay? But whatever it is, this was the prevailing myth. And the myth, of course, didn't conform to reality, and there has actually been a net flow of funds from the developing countries to the developed countries. Just to give you a sense of what has been happening in Africa, since capital account liberalization, in Africa there has been more capital flowing out of Africa, particularly to Europe, than which has come in the form of aid or in the form of FDI. That's just one number, but there are any number of numbers you can cite. Where has the money gone? Well, up to 2008, almost half of it went to the United States, because for a variety of reasons, there was a sense of security about keeping your money in the States, and given what has happened since Mr. Trump was elected a couple of weeks ago, there has been a huge flow of funds going into the United States. That's why the US dollar has strengthened despite all odds, and so on and so forth. Now, has this flow of funds which might have gone to developing countries really helped? Well, unfortunately, the figures suggest otherwise, that although there has been a great deal of increase of financial flows abroad suggested by the occur line, the yellow-orange line, there has actually been a slight but none decline in what economists call gross fixed capital formation. And this is basically what has happened. So what I think is very important is that one should begin to ask oneself, what is wrong with economic theory? That the great gurus of finance are telling us things which do not seem to have any correspondence to reality. The Sverige Bank prize, which is called the Nobel Laureate for Economics, was awarded a couple of years ago to two people who had completely diametrically opposite views, Mr. Farmer and Mr. Schiller. This is the kind, well, it's nice to suggest that the bank prize is being a reward for peaceful coexistence, but I don't think that was certainly the intent. In any case, let me, I'm quite conscious of the time that I've exceeded my time about an hour and a half ago, but allowing for the fact that time is running very fast, let me just run through some of the other points. I think it is basically the evidence even before 2009 was that the cost of funds was not lowered by the easier availability of funds, and that while some of the old sources of volatility and instability in the financial sector were reduced, new sources were introduced instead. Now, this was very different from what was conceived of in 1944. And it's important to recognize that the ambition of 1944, the Bretton Woods moment, if you will call it that, was not just to create the conditions for monetary and financial stability, but also to create the conditions for sustaining growth, for sustaining job creation, and as I mentioned earlier, for post-war reconstruction and post-colonial development. So we now have a situation where international finance is in a very, very serious mess. And we have a situation where there are unsustainable global imbalances. We have no deterrence for countries to accumulate huge reserves. In fact, many economies in East Asia are accumulating huge reserves precisely because they feel that the system is so unstable and so threatening that it is in their interest to protect themselves. But the whole world cannot go about protecting themselves through accumulating reserves. And this is obviously a very suboptimal condition. If you do not develop a system where you have security in the system, you create the perverse incentive for everybody to try to protect themselves. Okay? In the Latin American literature, this is sometimes referred to as the desire for self-insurance in East Asia. I've disagreed with my Latin American friends on the use of the term self-insurance because there's no insurance element involved. Insurance, at least as we traditionally conceive of it. So it's a misnomer to think of it as a system of self-insurance. But I think you understand what the incentives for doing so. So you basically have a non-system which has existed now for 4.5 decades, since the early 1970s. And you have a situation where there is a need for regulation, but you have incredibly a consensus of the political center for not regulating the center, finance. And I say this because it is important to recognize that this is not some kind of a right-wing conspiracy alone. Many of the people who have been associated with social democracy in Europe or with what is called liberal politics in the US have been part of this. People like Larry Summers, for example, or if you think of Jacques Delors and some of the other developments here in Europe. So what you have is whatever regulation exists is often inadequate and inappropriate, and there is a need for better capital account flows management. So there is a need to develop a reform agenda, and I know that I'm running out of time, so let me just flash that, in my view, some of the desiderata of such a reform agenda is to ensure greater macro-financial stability, to ensure that countries can adopt and pursue counter-cyclical macroeconomic policies and prudential risk management. They are able to finance growth, and you have a financial system which is more developmentally oriented, that it is also inclusive. And this is very important. I think the issues of inclusion are more than just a little bit of microcredit, in a few societies. There's much more to it than that, and a greater degree of policy coherence. Now, the reform situation is unfortunately very, very poor. There is very little desire to move in any acceptable direction. President-elect Trump has promised to undo whatever was introduced by Dodd-Frank, which was a very inadequate response to the problems created by the dismantling of Glass-Steagall by people like Robert Rubin and Larry Summers at the end of the Clinton administration. So you have a very poor system in the US, a system which has emerged in Europe, which is also very problematic for other reasons, and you have a system which has introduced what are called capital requirements, which are quite onerous, particularly for developing countries, or what are politely termed sometimes emerging market economies. So the result is problematic not only for developing countries, but often also for some of the so-called transition economies of the former Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So you do not have a fundamental push towards systemic reform. Let me now move to the third element of what I wanted to speak about, and this is really a further cry from what I've just discussed in terms of both trade and finance. When the founders of the Food and Agriculture Organization got together in Montreal in 1945, their understanding of nutrition was quite different from our contemporary understanding. There was a sense that thanks to the devastation of war, there wasn't enough food to go around, and so on and so forth. And this is reflected in the charter, the preamble of the charter statement of the Food and Agriculture Organization. Today, however, I think we have a much more sophisticated, but I think we are still learning a great deal, understanding of malnutrition and its challenges. And I think it's important for us to distinguish between three elements of what might be termed malnutrition. First, the need for macronutrients. And we mainly think of hunger in this respect, of whether or not you have enough dietary energy. And dietary energy is basically what we popularly refer to as carbohydrates, calories, joules, or whatever. And I want to assure you, because this is a subject of some dispute, I was partly responsible for some of the hunger estimates, which many people are very fond of trashing these days, often with good intentions, but let's remember that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. And so we have an unwilling, a push to combine all kinds of very diverse elements into a single composite index to measure hunger, which I think is not going to solve anything. But anyway, we have a very conservative definition of what constitutes hunger in the world, and there are problems, of course, associated with that, which you find in the FAO numbers. The second type of malnutrition refer to micronutrient deficiencies, and here we are referring to minerals, vitamins, and trace elements as well. And this is often referred to as hidden hunger, because it's not something you perceive, whether you have enough iodine in your diet, for example. And so it's very often not easy to induce people to have those kinds of micronutrients. So you find different ways of doing so. You can do so by legislation. Many countries in Europe, for example, require that table salt includes iodine, for example, and so on and so forth. There are many ways to deal with some of these things, but let us remember that it is very important to get these minerals, vitamins, and the most crucial period is during the so-called first 1,000 days, the moment between the time of conception until the time until the child is about 2 years of age. And so this whole issue is intimately tied up with caregiving, with motherhood, with pregnancy, and postnatal care. And these are often beyond the scope of governments as normally conceived. So the challenge becomes even more important about how we deal with such challenges. The third are what refer to what are called diet-related non-communicable diseases. There are some communicable diseases like for example, lung cancer, which have little to do with diet per se, but non-communicable diseases. Now, there is a tendency in the literature, in the popular literature, to focus on obesity. And obesity is a real problem, but it's only part of the problem of diet-related non-communicable diseases. If, for example, you have too much blood sugar, and that exacerbates the diabetes, which is very, very widespread now in many developing countries. That problem is very serious, but not all people who are overweight are diabetic, and many people who are diabetic are not overweight. So it's very important to recognize that the criteria, the manifestation of obesity or overweightness is not a very useful indicator. And this problem is very serious, especially in middle-income countries. So you find that about 13 or 14 years ago, Latin American countries, Central American countries in particular, overtook the US in terms of the number of people who are overweight or obese. Ironically, it was a time when the former president of Coca-Cola in Mexico had become president of the Mexican Republic. Now, let me give you a quick sense. I'm reminded that I'm running out of time. A quick sense of some of the multiple problems of malnutrition. And I want to just quickly mention the last line, that there are estimated to be 2.1 billion people who are overweight in the year 2014, of whom about a third, about 700 million people, are obese. A serious problem related to a number of issues. And let me emphasize that the estimates right now about the economic costs of malnutrition are somewhere in the region of about 5%. But most of it is accounted for by overweight and obesity. And this is very important because economic valuation of malnutrition is in itself inherently problematic because it tends to focus on the problems associated with people who are of means rather than of the poor. Okay? So there is an implicit bias in the very way we try to look at the economic costs of malnutrition. And this, I think, is important. Now, just to give you a sense, just from obesity alone is now considered to be the third largest problem in terms of comparative economic burden, following armed conflict and smoking. Okay? It costs 2 trillion annually, okay? Just to give you a sense of what it implies. Now, there are only about 8% of countries in the world today who do not have at least one serious problem with malnutrition. Norway, I think, is one of those countries. Sorry, the last line is a mistake. It's not 15 countries, it's 16 countries. And basically what it does, what the challenge is with malnutrition, okay, let me digress a little bit. One of the great achievements of Michelle Obama during her period as First Lady of the US, she managed to reduce childhood obesity in the US very dramatically. During the decade until 2013, childhood obesity went down 43%, and most of it in the second half decade, and most of it during when she was in the White House. Now, what did she do? She basically started a campaign involving diets as well as exercise. Okay? Now, when it was time for her, but she didn't get very much money for the campaign, and she basically went about doing it. When Barack Obama wanted a second term, the food companies came to her and basically said, we really want to support your campaign, but the exercise should be, the focus should be on exercise, not on food, So don't talk about food, talk about exercise. And that's basically, and she basically, drank the Kool-Aid, and so you will find that the reduction in childhood obesity has sort of tapered off. Very little reduction in the second period, partly because of this compromise she's made. Now, why do I mention this? Because some of you probably who have followed the American press know that about 2 months ago, there was a big expose about how professors at different universities, including at Harvard, had basically, in the 1960s, participated in publicizing ostensible research which shifted the problem of cardiovascular disease away from the problems relating to sugar consumption and focus on this thing called cholesterol. Okay? Now, this research is now been refuted, and now the relationship between cholesterol and cardiovascular disease is now very much the subject of a great deal of debate, and in fact debunked. It's no longer in the US dietary guidelines. But for half a century, pharmaceutical companies made a lot of money from this. But it was also beneficial to the food companies, food and beverage companies. And one needs to understand this. So you have a situation which is not new, And so so basically, reforming the food system sounds simple and straightforward, but it actually involves a great deal of a great number of challenges. And this is the challenge of public-private partnerships as well, okay? Because how do we move forward in a way which is in the public's best interest, especially if you're a public which has grown up with sugar and whatever else, and you're not used to giving it up. Okay, so these are very, very important challenges. Likewise with what is conceived of as value addition in the food chain. Okay, so there are very, very many problems involved, and I don't want I don't have the time to get into some of the details involved, but I think it's very important for us to recognize that the challenges involve not only food, it also involves the World Health Organization and what it can do, and basically it has almost no funding to do any of this. And the fact that the United Nations has declared a decade of action against malnutrition may mean very, very little, because you have an alliance of forces who may not want to do very much about certain aspects of the challenges of malnutrition. So I think it is important for us to recognize that we are living in a situation where the challenges of governance are very, very different given the problems which we are trying to deal with. And so the challenge for us then is to try to begin to think of novel ways in which we can better address these problems, and to recognize that the different areas in which we work very often require very different types of solutions. And there's no one simple template which is suitable for us to try to resolve all these problems. So I hope I have been able to persuade you of that. I promised the organizers that we would have a little bit of time for discussion. So allow me to stop here, and perhaps we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jomo. And we have time for a couple of questions, and I will just let Professor Jomo point out the questions.
There's a gentleman over there.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this very interesting introduction to this conference. My name is Rostam Newworth. I'm from the law faculty at the University of Macau. And I teach WTO law, so I was very interested in hearing your very profound historical analysis linking the flaws to the failure of the International Trade Organization. I also very much appreciate the link with finance, and also a very serious other problem, non-trade problem, although non-trade is probably the wrong word, because everything I think is related in our world. And therefore I would like to ask you to what extent you mentioned policy coherence, and which I also very much I think link to the need for maybe a greater cognitive coherence in terms of finding maybe even in our brain the new ideas that you just mentioned. And I don't know, I'm just asking from a legal perspective, how could this be done in terms of a systemic reform that you mentioned, like linking different trade-related, non-trade issues conceptually, and then implementing it legally? My personal feeling is that what has been forgotten since the creation of the United Nations is, and in international law in particular, is strengthening the role of the individual, the private individual. I think there is a parallel world of what lawyers call the lex mercatoria, the law merchant, but which has never been linked to the public international law system. And I think this is where there is an opportunity in the situation that you mentioned, where there is a kind of despair about multilateralism. But maybe you have any other idea that you could share with how legally we could implement a reformed system that is maybe more adequate in dealing with these issues. Thank you very much.
Perhaps if there are one or two other Yes, the lady on the last row, please.
Hi, my name is Anne-Louise Lee. I'm a student at the University of Oslo. I have a question about your reflections around global nutrition governance. I was wondering if you could give us your perspectives on the rise of multi-stakeholder governance in this area, and especially the establishment of the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement, which is a global multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral partnerships for addressing challenges of malnutrition. Do you see this as a welcome development, or as an organization that perhaps undermine the multilateral system and its ability to respond to the challenge of malnutrition? Thanks.
Thank you. Is there, okay, I think we'll, one last one over here, please.
Thank you. I'm Jürgen Wiemann from German Development Institute and EADI. I enjoyed very much your presentation about WTO, and I wonder whether what you say could inform civil society campaigners on the benefits of the multilateral system. In Seattle, or since Seattle, the campaigners are campaigning against WTO, down with WTO, down with Bretton Woods system. But people like you and others should inform civil society of the potential benefits of an improved Bretton Woods system, or going back to Bretton Woods, going back to ITO. Not many people in the civil society know about ITO. It's very little known what was in the Havana Charter in 1944, 1947. So what is your feeling? Is there a chance of informing the liberal left in the world about the potential of the multilateral system, now as we are at the abyss of falling into the worst system or non-system that we can think of? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for those three questions. Since we have very little time, let me try to respond to those three, perhaps in reverse order. On the question of multilateralism, I have long been maintaining many of these issues. I think it is not a question of simply a question of multilateralism versus plurilateralism. There are other issues involved, and part of the problem right now is, particularly for the United States, but increasingly in Europe, in Japan, and elsewhere, you have very powerful corporate interests who are trying to shape the multilateral agenda. It is not as if the multilateral agenda is being shaped by enlightened government policy makers, on the basis of a shared understanding of how multilateralism can contribute to creating a much more stable world economy and enable development and equitable growth. This unfortunately is not the situation. So I have continued, and I'm certainly not very popular in all civil society meetings and so on. But I think maintaining a balanced perspective is certainly something which at least some of the serious civil society advocates are open to. So just to give you an example, I did my colleagues did some of the estimates on the likely effects of the TTIP and on the TPP. This influenced some of the discussion in the US. In the case of Europe, Martin Wolf rubbished the estimates done by my colleague. But recently, in his own writings, to try to retrospectively understand what has been happening in the US, he has more or less conceded the very things he rubbished my colleague for. So it is a good sign that a very important commentator like Martin Wolf, who wrote a whole book in defense of trade liberalization about a dozen years ago, has now come to a more enlightened way of looking at it. But very often in the process of doing so, he has basically destroyed the credibility of a lot of other commentators which are not politically convenient for his particular cause at a particular moment in time. Now, on the question of the scaling up nutrition movement, I have a great deal to say about it, and I'll be happy to talk to you privately in some detail. But I think the basic problem of public-private partnerships is there. The lady who is now leads the Scaling Up Nutrition movement is used to be ambassador. She used to be agriculture minister for the Netherlands, and was ambassador for the Netherlands to Rome, to the Rome so-called UN food-based agencies in Rome. And throughout the time I was working to organize the second international conference on nutrition, she was quite honestly quite uninterested. So I was very surprised that she was chosen for the position of Scaling Up Nutrition movement. But she had been a very important proponent of something called AIM, the Amsterdam Initiative Against Malnutrition. And one of the principles of AIM is that is of involving the private sector in all solutions. So this is problematic. This can be problematic. If you insist that this is the only way to go forward, and you do not even specify the nature of the problem, that becomes in itself a huge problem. Her predecessor, David Nabarro, is now running for the Director General of the WHO. In the WHO, one of the big issues which has been fought over the last 4, maybe even 5 decades is the whole question of corporate interests. And the WHO developed certain very strict rules about who could represent, and it almost led to the breakup of the WHO, because the WHO was created in 1945, but before the WHO was created, there was something else called PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, which our colleagues from Latin America know something about. And PAHO basically had private sector participation. Now, PAHO was created over a century ago, and an individual doctor over a century ago was private sector. And so individual doctors legitimately participated. But today, what it means for the private sector to be involved is quite different from what it meant over a century ago. So the implications of that are very different. So I think we have to be very cognizant about, you can have rules which have very, very different implications in different periods of time. Our chair is standing up, so I have to be very brief with the first question. But I think, if I may put it that way, I have always had some difficulty, perhaps because my own training was in economics, with a so-called rights-based approach to many of these problems. And very often you find a huge contention between what are essentially, what many of us would agree today are human rights, and the other rights, which are property rights. And very often in the real world, property rights trump human rights. And so the question is, how do we, so an individual-based approach may not necessarily be a solution when most people have very few, very limited basis for either exerting their human rights or consumer rights or producer rights and so on and so forth. So it would be very important, in my view, that we have a clarification of what kinds of rights and whether there's a hierarchy of rights and how we adjudge that hierarchy of rights. Right now in the world of rights, even in the world of human rights, development rights are not even recognized by most countries. It is really political and civil rights which are really ascendant, and socio-economic and cultural rights may take second place, but certainly development rights are very, very low on that hierarchy of things. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you, and I will be here until tomorrow afternoon and look forward to talking to you individually. Thank you very much.